Hello. Welcome to the second day of the Einstein Forum Conference on Judgment. We began last night with a judge. Today we'll start with two different types of practitioners of judgment, art critics. And notably, both of these art critics have practiced the art that they now judge, and maybe still practice it. First up is James Wood. Please join me in welcoming him to the Einstein Forum.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Dominic. I'm going to talk about two types of judgment. And I'll start with a possibly apocryphal story. It's about the London literary critic and editor Cyril Connolly, who was the editor of a London journal in the 1940s called Horizon. It was 1949, and Cyril Connolly was in Rome, sitting at a cafe table. An English poet, who he instantly recognized, and who recognized him, walked past and stopped and said, "Connolly, whatever happened to that poem that I submitted and you accepted, and then you sent me the galley proof, the Druckfahnen, I think as Germans would say. You sent me the galley, the proof, but I never heard from you again." And Connolly said, "Well, obviously the poem was good enough to put in proof in galleys, but not good enough to publish in Horizon." It's a funny story that's also suggestive about judgment, of course. How did Connolly know that the poem was good, but not good enough? What is that faculty of judgment? Is there not something arbitrary, subjective, capricious, and slightly obnoxious about such a mystique of judgment? Of course, this has been a problem in both aesthetics and ordinary common sense for a very long time. There seem to be two types of judgment, two kinds of aesthetic appraisal. The first is hermeneutic. It has to do with the search for meaning, with interpretation. We have, say, a poem in front of us, and we need to do a number of things in order to read the poem well. First of all, perhaps we need to describe it. What kind of poem is it? Does it have a recognizable form? Perhaps we ask when it was written or who by. We need to work out what it means, and we're interested in the relation of meaning to verbal effects and techniques. If the poem rhymes, say, how does rhyme modify or determine the meaning of the poem? What kinds of imagery are involved? And so on. We're all familiar with this kind of procedure. We do it every single day. And we're also aware that interpretation of this kind makes use of all manner of judgment. If, say, we relate the poem in hand to another poem, then we're likely to get better at this when we've read more poems. The more texts we read, the better we become at knowing what to look for. But there's an extra literary judgment too. When we read fiction, say, we may be better readers of certain human dilemmas and situations if we've lived through some of them ourselves. We're probably better readers at 40 than at 20. Literary criticism in this sense is omnivorous and pragmatic. The best method is to use all there is to use when reading a text. And since using all there is to use is agglomerative, it accumulates, I think we could say three things about this kind of literary judgment or literary interpretation. Much of it is a craft or skill that can be taught. Doing more of it is part of that education. And since doing more of it also involves something as hard to define but crucial as living longer, the wisdom of experience, the wisdom of life, then literary interpretation must necessarily involve extra literary judgment. I think that's all common sense. There's a second type of judgment, the one closer perhaps to the kind that Cyril Connolly was exercising in Rome. This is not interpretation so much as aesthetic evaluation, not a search for meaning so much as a quick decision about aesthetic success. I like this one, This moves me, this one works, this poem is just better than that poem. This feels good. This is the kind of judgment that's often speedy and reflexive, while the judgment involved in interpretation is slow and painstaking. When we're deciding whether a piece of writing or music is great or less than great, or trash, we're usually moving fast. The book is hurled against the wall. We walk out of the cinema. More respectably, an editor at a publishing house or a fiction editor at a magazine moves just as quickly. Most publishers claim to know within a paragraph whether it's worth their time to read on. Preeminently, of course, it's this kind of summary judgment that is associated with that dread spectre, the critic, who threshes through the delicate strivings of poor artists, the literary embodiment of the father in Kafka's story, The Judgment, who essentially forces poor writers to jump off bridges. It was beautifully put by an American poet, Frank O'Hara, in the 1960s in a poem called The Critic. Here are just a couple of lines from that poem. The Critic: I cannot think of you other than you are, the assassin of my orchards. Oh, be droll, be jolly, and be temperate. Do not frighten me more than you have to. I must live forever. I hope that poem would have got into Horizon. This is the judgment that intimidates, repels, impresses, gatekeeps, authorizes, deauthorizes, and which, because it's a little too close to the connoisseurial, is often dismissed as having too much to do with the opaque mysteries of taste. How does Connolly know the poem is not good enough? He just knows it. Aesthetic judgment of this sort seems as wildly subjective and imperious as the parent who simply says, because I say so. The sort of circular logic that sublimely I once heard in Dresden when I was unwisely crossing a road against the light, and a good Dresden citizen next to me muttered, Der rote Mann ist der rote Mann. I'm going to invoke the dread word Kant, though I think it's much wiser to take the Albie Sachs approach, which is I've never read a word, and I'm not about to start today. I have, unfortunately, read a word or two, fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately, because I'm about now to risk all by invoking him. Kant, as I understand it, says that aesthetic judgment isn't logical, not objective, can only be subjective, and relegates a certain portion of this second kind of judgment that I'm talking about, the Connolly judgment, to what he calls the taste of sense, which he distinguishes from the taste of reflection. The taste of sense has to do with what we find pleasant. This Canary wine is pleasant, says the wine drinker. Well, it is to me. When someone objects, you just say, it is to me, and that's the end of the conversation. The taste of reflection, says Kant, is reflection on the beautiful, not just on pleasure or on aesthetic success. I'll take that away, not just on pleasure. And such reflections have a claim to the universal. When we say that piece of Beethoven is beautiful, it doesn't make any sense to add, well, it's beautiful for me. That would be sort of comic. To talk about the beautiful, says Kant, is to enter the realm of the universally valid. Such judgment claims universal agreement, even though it can't prove it or even argue its way to it. I'm not saying that these two things, the sense of taste and the sense of reflection, are quite map onto the two types of judgment I'm talking about, but I want to get this sense of the second type of judgment, the quick decision about the poem or the first paragraph of the novel, as being in some ways quite close, at least mythically, quite close to the wine drinking argument, wine drinking example. So, all right, let's reprise. We have two rough categories of judgment. One, interpretation, is patient, non-evaluative in the aesthetic sense, has to do with meaning and can be taught, or at least contains many elements that can be taught, and is professional. A second type of judgment is swift, possibly impatient, is highly evaluative in the aesthetic sense, has to do with pleasure or displeasure, and probably can't be taught. The first is respectable, the second may be alarmingly connoisseurial. And complicatedly, both types of judgment, looking for meaning and looking for aesthetic success, clearly involve extra-literary elements of judgment, being in the world. My own feeling is that these two types of judgment are not as different as they appear to be, certainly not as far apart as wine tasting and praising Beethoven. But I'll come to that in a minute. Before I do, it might be worth noting that the formal academic study of modern literature, which starts in the early 20th century, so it's a real latecomer, begins by playing out exactly the dilemma I've just sketched. In 1926, when the Faculty of English was formally established at Cambridge University, a young scholar named I.A. Richards was appointed university lecturer. This was a decided improvement in his circumstances. Because the study of English literature was a risky and untested field, Richards's college, Magdalen, would not pay him a salary to teach it. Instead, in the old style, like a rural doctor, he collected weekly tuition directly from students each week in the classroom. As late as 1926, isn't that incredible? Richards was distressed by the anarchy he found among his students, specifically the anarchy of taste. His students seemed to have no expertise around interpreting and judging a text. They expressed the most uncontrolled prejudices and foolish summary judgments. So he set up an experiment, which was something like a blind wine tasting session indeed. He gave his students 10 poems from the history of English literature, poems by people like Thomas Hardy, Christina Rossetti, John Donne, D.H. Lawrence, but he withheld the names so that the poems were all anonymous. He asked his students then to write up their interpretations of these poems, particularly their aesthetic evaluations. Did they think this poem was good or bad, better or worse than the one they just read? Then he published these evaluations in a book called Practical Criticism, which was published in 1929, a book that he called A Study in Inferior Reading. It's great. Because the students were really bad at it. Utter rubbish, wrote one student about a Milton poem. I can't make out what all the shouting is about, wrote another about a Shakespeare sonnet. Alongside the poems and the students' intemperate and untutored remarks, Richards provided a commentary, what he called the record of a piece of field work in comparative ideology. He noted the immaturity of the readers, 19 or 20 years old at most, and how little they had read. Interestingly, even then, I don't know why I say even then, but I meant even then because we're familiar with it now as a dynamic in gendered reading. He observed that young women who were among those students at Cambridge were better readers than the men, probably because they had read more, and certainly because they were less foolishly self-confident. Richards examined how often students substituted stock responses, preconceptions, the expression of bewilderment for patient interpretation. From the fact that many of his students attacked canonical poets, he wondered about how often our judgment of work is swayed by what he called the quality of the reading we ordinarily give to author, when rank and character have been officially settled. When we know we're reading Milton or Shakespeare, we're more likely to be respectful. Moving outwards from literary expertise, Richards alights on what we might call experiential judgment, the wisdom that comes from being in the world. These were young men and women, immature, quote, not intelligence alone, but in emotional development. Though many of them, he added, will not get much better at reading even as they get older because they don't read enough. Richards concludes with some practical suggestions towards the improvement of interpretation and teaching, both at school level and at university level. But he adds this caveat, suggestive, I think, for us today as we think about judgment. Quote, there are subjects, mathematics, physics, and the descriptive sciences, which can be discussed in terms of verifiable facts and precise hypotheses. There are other subjects, he continues, the concrete affairs of commerce, law, organization, and police work, which can be handled by rules of thumb and generally accepted conventions. But in between, he continues, is the vast corpus of problems, assumptions, adumbrations, fictions, prejudices, tenets, the sphere of random beliefs and hopeful guesses, the whole world, in brief, of abstract opinion and disputation about matters of feeling. To this world belong everything about which civilized man cares most. And he finishes, I need only instance ethics, metaphysics, morals, religion, aesthetics, and the discussion surrounding liberty, nationality, justice, love, truth, faith, and knowledge to make this plain. It's quite a list. I mean, are you finished? As a subject matter for discussion, he finishes, poetry is a certain and typical inhabitant of this sort of in-between world. He offered his book he wrote in order to make some suggestions towards a better control of these tricky components of our lives. So basically, Richards was saying that criticism does indeed use all there is to use, and that this pragmatism of reading is such a strange, delicate, and tricky agglomeration of different elements that some of it can be taught, while some of it may be less teachable. Reading well is not natural, he says. It's a craft, like mathematics, cooking, and shoemaking are crafts. As such, it can be taught. We need to attend, he says, better to the object, the text in hand, but also acknowledge and analyze even our subjectivity. Use all there is to use, but do it with greater order and discipline. That book, Practical Criticism, was extremely influential. When I studied English at the same university in the mid-1980s, you still went every week for exercises in close reading, which were called Practical Criticism, in tribute to I.A. Richards. And in your finals exams, you still sat for a paper which was called the dating paper. Not quite as fun as it sounds, actually, where you were given anonymous passages from English literature, and you had to roughly date them, but where you got higher marks for the quality of your argumentation rather than the exactitude of your dating, which makes total sense. And it also makes total sense that now has dropped out some time ago of the finals exams at Cambridge and isn't demanded of students, but it was an incredibly good discipline for me. So it was a really influential book, but unfortunately, criticism drew the wrong conclusion. It's clear, I hope it's clear from my summary, that Richards was trying to keep these two types of judgment, interpretation and aesthetic evaluation, together, to keep an attention on the object and on our subjectivity as one total mode of attention. But out of Richards's book came almost the opposite, came the steady, technical fetishization of close reading, and aesthetic evaluation began to fade away. What was called after Richards, say in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the UK and America, the new criticism, began to focus exclusively on the novel and poem as a self-referential object, a well-made urn, an autonomous structure. We were told that we should not commit what was known as the intentional fallacy, basically speculating about what an author intended to do, and we should not commit the affective fallacy, essentially the error of judging a literary work on the emotional effect on the reader rather than judging the text for its inherent qualities and structures. If you look at the course of 20th century criticism, in at least academic criticism, it's pretty clear that the author began to be slowly removed by this mode called the new criticism in the 40s and 50s, and then thoroughly killed off, probably after the war, by structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction, the so-called death of the author. Interpretation became essentially poetics, or to use the very interesting word that I heard Albie Sachs used yesterday in his marvelous talk became formalism. I love that moment when you were talking about destroying, it's important to destroy the formalism every so often. Poetics is essentially formalism, and all that in-between stuff that Richards was talking about is suspiciously considered, if at all. So, yes, deconstruction taught several generations how to read texts against themselves, against the author, so to speak. And I've greatly benefited, as have most people most readers from these developments. But there has been a cost. We've become far, far better technicians of reading. But in university classrooms, teachers don't talk very much about what makes a book beautiful. The very thing that most matters to writers, the first question they ask of a literary work, is it any good, might be irrelevant to university teachers. Or if not quite irrelevant, then so settled as to be not worth discussing. Over the course of the 20th century, aesthetic evaluation came to seem tainted with the aura of the connoisseurial, stained with the red grape of the wine taster. To spend one's time explaining how a text works was not necessarily ever to talk about how well it works. Maybe it was, but not necessarily. I'll give you a quick picture from my own experience as a student of something I was dimly aware of as a student and now can put into more coherent language. Well, you'd hope I could after 40 years. I was taught to read literature at Cambridge by a brilliant post-structuralist critic called Stephen Heath, who had himself studied with Roland Barthes in Paris, and whose first book actually was on the Nouveau Roman. I have an image in my mind of Dr. Heath, who was slightly short-sighted, holding a sheet of paper, the hallowed text, very close to his eyes. So like he'd do this sort of thing. And it became, for me, somehow the symbolic embodiment of his scrutinizing avidity, while he threw out his favorite question about a paragraph or stanza. What's at stake in this passage? It was always an utterly terrifying question. Like, I don't know, what's at stake in this passage? Now, as some of you, perhaps many of you in this audience will know, he meant something more specific, professionalized, and narrow than the colloquial usage would generally imply. He meant something like, what is the dilemma of meaning in this passage? What is at stake in maintaining the appearance of coherent meaning in this performance we call literature? How is meaning wobbling, threatening to collapse into its repressions? He was appraising literature as Freud might have studied one of his patients, where what is at stake for you in being here doesn't necessarily mean what's at stake for you in wanting to get healthy or happy, but almost the opposite. What is at stake for you in maintaining your chronic unhappiness? The inquiry is suspicious, though not necessarily hostile. That way of reading could be called broadly deconstructive, and I was absolutely educated in its protocols. Put simply, it proceeds on the assumption that literary texts, like people, have an unconscious that frequently betrays them. They say one thing, but mean another. Their own figures of speech, metaphors, images, figurative turns of phrases, are the slightly bent keys to their own unlocking. The critic can unravel, deconstruct a text by reading it as one might, and being simple here, but as one might read a Freudian slip. And just as an awareness of how people unconsciously defend and betray themselves enriches our ability to comprehend them, so a similar awareness enriches our comprehension of a piece of literature. Instead of agreeing with people's self-assessments, we learn how to read them in a stealthy and contrary manner, brushing them against their own grain, or as Virginia Woolf wonderfully puts it in A Room of One's Own, there is a spot the size of a shilling, well, in my case, rather larger than the size of a shilling, on the back of one's head, which you can't see yourself, but which the writer, or in this case, the critic, sees by going behind you. Instead of agreeing with people's self-assessments, we learn how to read them and brush them against their own grain. At university, I began to understand that a poem or novel might be self-divided, that its intentions might be beautifully lucid, but its deepest motivations helplessly contradictory. Indeed, deconstruction tends to specialize in, perhaps overemphasize, the ways in which texts contradict themselves. How, say, The Tempest is at once anti-colonialist in aspiration and colonialist in assumption. Or how Jane Austen's novels are both proto-feminist and patriarchally structured. Or how the great novels of adultery like Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary and Effie Briest dream of female transgression, but simultaneously enforce punishment for that transgression. Critical intelligence, it should be obvious, is made more complex and sophisticated by this awareness that literature is an always frail ideological achievement, only ever a sentence away from dissolution. But, and that's all great, and I benefited from it, we're all beneficiaries, I take it, of that kind of reading. But think of the looser, perhaps more generous usage preferred by writers and interested readers. When a book reviewer or someone in a creative writing workshop or a fellow author complains, "I just couldn't see what was at stake in the book," or "I see that the issue matters to the writer, but she didn't manage to make me feel that it was at stake in the novel," a different statement is also being made about meaning. The implication here is that meaning has to be earned, that a novel or poem creates the aesthetic environment of its importance. A novel in which the stakes are felt to be too low is one that has failed to make a case for its seriousness, and that's why writers are fond of the idea of earned stakes and unearned stakes, that phrase that you get a lot in workshop. You know, you haven't earned this moving, the death scene at the end of the short story. A book that hasn't earned its effects doesn't deserve any success. So this is interesting. What's at stake? What's at stake? Two different types of judgment, two different constituencies in a way. Both are central to their relative critical discourses. Each is close to the other and yet also quite far apart. In stakes one, that's to say interpretation, the text's success is suspiciously scanned, with the expectation, perhaps the hope, that the piece of literature under scrutiny will turn out to be productively unsuccessful. In stakes two, the one that the writers use, I didn't think there was anything at stake, the text's success is anxiously searched for with the assumption that the piece of literature's lack of success cannot be productive for reading, but simply renders the book not worth picking up. The first way of reading is non-evaluative, at least at the level of craft or technique. The second is only evaluative and wagers everything on technical success on questions of craft and aesthetic achievement. Both modes are interestingly narrow, and their narrowness mirrors each other. Not to think ever about literature evaluatively is not to think like a writer, or perhaps like an ordinary reader. It cuts literature off from the instincts and ambitions of the very people who created it. But to think only in terms of evaluation, in terms, say, of craft and technique, favors those categories at the expense of many different kinds of reading, chiefly the great interest of reading literature as an always unsettled achievement. To read only suspiciously, stakes one, is to risk becoming a cynical detective of the word. To read only evaluatively, stakes two, is to risk becoming a naif of meaning, a connoisseur of local effects, someone who brings the standards of a professional guild, or amateur guild even, to bear on the wide, unprofessional drama of meaning. Nowadays, alas, each kind of reading tends to exclude the other, which, as I was suggesting, was the opposite, I think, of what I.A. Richards was trying to do in his book Practical Criticism. Because remember that criticism, meaning writer's criticism, existed for centuries outside the academy, practiced as literature by writers. It wasn't, in fact, I.A. Richards, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge who coined the term practical criticism in his wonderful, mad and capacious book, the Biographia Literaria from 1819. And what Coleridge is most earnestly trying to do in that book, alongside introducing Fichte and so on to English readers, is convince those readers through a series of passionately close readings that his friend and competitor, William Wordsworth, is England's greatest poet. It actually becomes an incredibly moving book to read if you begin to see that a pretty ambitious poet himself is laying it all on the line for someone he considers far greater than him. That's what's at stake for Coleridge. It's one writer speaking about another. Surely Coleridge and Richards were right, and a good deal of academic criticism is not quite right. insofar as it tends to exclude aesthetic evaluation. My own feeling is that the two types of judgment absolutely belong together because they can't really be separated. To account for a poem or a novel, to interpret it properly, is also simultaneously to say, this moves me. To account for the effects of a text, in the technical sense, is to account for the effect, in an emotional sense, a text has on me. The effective is the affective. As I said, I'm wary of even discussing Kant in this company and extremely wary of criticizing Kant in this company. But my feeling is that, my sense, no, I won't use sense or feeling. I think, insofar as I understand his distinctions, that he makes wine tasting sound too subjective, and makes attending a concert or praising Beethoven sound a little too objective or universalizable. They aren't quite the same things. Why shouldn't the sense of taste and the sense of reflection meet somewhere in the middle, as they do in life? And why can't both of them, reflection and taste, interpretation and aesthetic judgment, why can't both of them involve reasons, involve reasoning? They're not just sudden. I mean, even the wine taster. I mean, I may swallow a glass of drink a glass of wine, and then say, "Wow, this is fabulous wine," but I haven't exactly closed the conversation at that moment, have I? The interlocutor might say, "Well, why?" And you would begin, as you would with any object, to give reasons. I might begin to describe its properties. This wine is richer and deeper than the wine we had at dinner last night. It's older, maybe. It's had more time to mature, and so on. And perhaps accounting for the wine sits on a spectrum where further along that spectrum, we account for Beethoven's beauty in rather similar ways. More sophisticated, I'm sure. But we give reasons, we analyze structure, we make comparisons with composers or with pieces that move us less, and so on. Interpretation can't easily be separated from evaluation, and both modes of judgment adduce reasons. Anyway, at the most basic level, evaluation was always being made in the 20th century about texts, because it was being made at the level of the curriculum and the syllabus. Judgment was always being made about the worth of something when it was chosen for university study. So I think taste may be less subjective than Kant says it is, because we can adduce reasons, and reflection may be less universalizable than Kant says it is, shot through as it is with the premises of evaluation. And both modes of judgment can adduce reasons, and neither is objective in any provable way. And we can live with that, because criticism is the art of persuasion, not the science of demonstration. Criticism uses all there is to use. And the wonderful thing, I'll just finish with, for me at least, is that the literary journalist, which is what I am, is in the right space to bring these two types of judgment together. The literary reviewer judges. Indeed, in the common, slightly dismissive university understanding, the academic reads the hallowed text, and the journalistic critic judges the notice, the review, the summary judgment. But of course, the journalistic critic, if he or she is given enough space to write, and that's crucial, reads too. Ideally, we read and judge at the same time. And let us hold out the fantasy. The journalistic critic, we hope, sits somewhere at a table in Rome and tells people what's good and what isn't. Thank you.
You can pose questions there with the Q&A function, and one of the staff will read out your questions as well. Thank you. Susan, I saw your hand first.
James, that was a fabulous paper. I mean, as I said all too briefly last night, I actually don't think that Kant's writing on judgment belongs to his better works. I would much rather listen to you. But among the many questions that your talk suggested, I just have one. You mentioned fairly early on, and many of us have experienced it, that some editors at major publishers think that they can judge in a paragraph whether or not the book is worth reading. Do you, as a critic, ever feel something like that? And if so, what do you base your judgment on?
There are different mythologies, aren't there, about this? That you'll counter people who say, I use the page 54 technique or whatever it is. You stand in the bookshop and you open, whatever. Yes, and just before answering that, it was striking me as I was talking that there's a slightly unpleasant paradox in this, which is that the thing that looks connoisseurial and potentially amateurish is, of course, in the hands of the publisher or the magazine editor or whatever, an entirely professionalized thing, right? They are the professional gatekeepers who are using this quick techne, I guess, or whatever it is. No, it's not that. I guess it's the opposite. They're using instinct. Yes, exactly. Yes, nous, whatever. I wouldn't trust myself to do a paragraph. I don't know what there are lots of readers in this room. I don't think a paragraph would be enough, and I think that's publishers' braggadocio, don't you think? I mean,
well, I don't know, but you must have read zillions of books that you receive, and people want you to review them.
Yes.
You can't read them all entirely before you decide, this one I'm going to review and this one I'm not.
No. So this is where we get to the subjective. You're partly just swayed by things you like. This isn't my kind of thing. But I think generally all of us were probably responsive to vitality, aren't we? Some sort of life that announces itself on the page, something that isn't dead. And we get a pretty good sense of that within a few pages of what's alive and what's dead. It doesn't have to be original, but what isn't simply following the conventional. I mean, it doesn't have to be original because most literature isn't original, obviously. But it's a problem. My daughter spent last summer as an intern. It was like 2 months, doing something that might sound quite fun, but which was actually drudgery. She was working as an intern at the New Yorker 2 days a week, reading their fiction slush pile. But in fact, this is like you have to imagine something akin to the TV, Law and Order, the police procedural, like when they come from the back room with an enormous packet of dusty briefs and depositions and say, "That's your work." Now it's digital, of course, but because the New Yorker has so many submissions, this is where it's like something out of a Dickens novel. They're always working off about 6 months earlier. So she comes in and they say to her, okay, this is January and February. She's working there in August. This is January and February. Just go through this. And I said to her, how many things are you reading a day? And she said, well, I'm not reading them, but I'm going through about 300 or 400 a day. Yeah. In order just to be able to, and of those, maybe 2 get sort of passed up the chain. So this is going on the whole time. And of course, in publishing, the thing that troubles me, and I bet troubles you too, is the knowledge that increasingly they're scrolling through your manuscript, not reading the paper, which I just think speeds everything up in unhelpful ways.
Stephen Holmes. Yeah, it's coming.
Hi, James. That was great.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a difference, but who is your favorite literary critic and who is the greatest literary critic in the English language? Why?
And once I say that, that will settle it. It's like the wine, right? You won't be able, there'll be no coming back.
I want to know if you can use the language you're using today in this brilliant theoretical talk to really give us a concrete. This relates to the idea of judging the judgment. And it would help, I think, to give a concrete sense. It's not A.A. Richards, I assume.
No, it's not A.A. Richards. Yeah. I do like about I.A. Richards, who then went on for a year or two to teach in America and taught the wonderful poetry critic Helen Vendler, who was a colleague of mine at Harvard. I like about Richards that the thing he became famous for and that she most liked about him was that often he just read the poems out aloud. It's like Benjamin's idea of a book just made of quotations. That voicing or revoicing can be enough. And of course, again, that's precisely the thing, which we'd call paraphrase in academic criticism, that is treated very suspiciously in the classroom. Like students are told, if you start paraphrasing the novel, you're probably not doing the right thing. Avoid that. You're not being a critic. But actually, in reviewing, the right kind of paraphrase, redescription, is absolutely crucial because you're trying to give the reader a sense of a text he or she probably hasn't read. And to that, in that regard, there are certain literary critics that I like very much because they give me that sense of the text. Virginia Woolf is very much one. In a completely different mode, Roland Barthes is very much one too, because I respond to his aestheticism and his mode of close reading, which is doubtless different from mine. And then growing up for me, there was a wonderful English critic who really was my university called V.S. Pritchett. He was well known as a short story writer. He'd written from about the 1930s to the 60s or 70s regularly for the New Statesman, and then when the New York Review of Books was founded, for the New York Review of Books. He was an English writer, and if you want a literary education, I mean, you don't need a literary education, but I wanted a literary education at the age of 20, and his 1,000-page book of collected essays, everything from Don Quixote to Salman Rushdie, was an unbelievable education. He really immerses the reader in the text, and he's a brilliant writer too. He was a great writer of dialogue in his early short stories in the 1930s, and I saw with amusement and resignation when watching Succession. I was thinking, this is very, very well-written dialogue, and then I saw the name Georgia Pritchett, and I thought, as we do with names these days, I will look that up. His granddaughter. And exactly as you would expect, right? She's not writing short stories. She's writing really good dialogue for TV. But yeah, Pritchett, Roland Barthes, Virginia Woolf. There are too many, really.
Alida Asman.
Thank you so much. You really told me my history again. But
Sure,
I would like to
very well.
make a difference here, refer to a difference between the academic and the journalist critics, because the biggest difference is you get your books on the table and you have to write about them. Yeah. The academic critic chooses the books out of from the shelves of a library. And the central question is, which authors do you read? And here you have to deal with a canon. My canon, when I grew up and studied Richards as the first text of my studies. The three authors I was raised on were T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and John Milton. Then I had a lacuna of 12 years. So I cut my career, went into family life, and by sheer coincidence, I found myself back again in the academy after 12 years of nothing. So wait a minute. The shock that I had was I had a post to teach English literature, but I was no longer equipped with anything that I had earned through my very hard studies.
Right.
So all these three authors were unteachable. The canon had been transformed. You know what a shock it was for Harold Bloom that the canon, great canon, his canon was no longer working. So I had to adapt very quickly to what the students were interested in, and now the whole thing was no longer just the text, but also the context. I had grown up with how not to read, all these prohibitions, and now the main interest was to put the text back into the context. Fortunately, this was proved to be my method. I really liked it, so I could adapt to it quickly. But it was a total separation going from one world to another, and this is what the canon has to do. It's the power, a structure built into the institutions, and your choices are very, very clearly restrained.
Yeah, very true. But yeah, we all laughed when you said you did nothing for 12 years. The fellow academic that I mentioned, Helen Wendler, who died a year ago or so, and who had studied with I.A. Richards and was a great poetry critic, she once said the most it was humanism enacted. It was about 2004 or 5, and I'd just come to Harvard as a visiting lecturer. And we had young children, and I'm sure I was complaining at how impossible it was to get anything done with all the noise and the being a parent and so on. And she, who had been a pioneering female academic in the university system, and also for most of her life a single mother, because her husband walked out quite early on her, said wonderfully, "But surely you understand that having children makes you a better literary critic." That's exactly in a way, what Richards is talking about, this extra literary judgment.
Costa Gebert.
Thank you, that was marvelous. I was wondering whether the two types of judgment that you describe are separate in outcome as seen from the outside, but are experienced as the same thing. Yes. I mean, the sheer sensual pleasure of discovering in the text something that the author probably didn't know is there is the same experience as the exhilaration at encountering beauty, right? It may express itself differently, but at least in my experience, psychologically, it's the same thing. Would you agree?
I totally agree. I think that's beautifully put. Right, different in outcome, but essentially inseparable. Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
Glenn Most.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful. I'm going to apply Judgment 1 to your paper.
Very good.
I think that you began thinking about this with a very strong opposition between Judgment 1 and Judgment 2, and that the more that you thought about it, the more you saw how much they have in common with one another. In your prose abstract, which presumably you wrote before you wrote the paper, you go so far as to distinguish between the former as secular and the latter as religious. That seems to me to be disastrous.
Yes.
And I'm glad that it did to you too, because so much of the attention to the Judgment 1 has been directed historically to religious texts, which have an infinity of meaning in them. But you still, I think, didn't go far enough in working out the connections between Judgment 1 and Judgment 2, as I think you will be pushed to do in the discussion now. For example, it's not that they both use arguments. I think that one could say, for example, that the texts that are most satisfying for Judgment 1 end up being accepted in Judgment 2.
Accepted.
Accepted. You get more out of interpreting them, and they end up becoming canonical. But I want to push you on another aspect of the difference you kept on making. You said a couple of times that Judgment 1 can be taught, and Judgment 2 cannot. Can Judgment 2 really not be taught? What makes you say that? When I look at the teaching of literature now, it seems to me that it's much more involved with trying to teach judgment 2 than judgment 1.
Yeah.
It's just not using aesthetic or poetic or literary criteria. It's using political or ideological criteria to say what is a better text than another one. Judgment 1 hardly gets taught at all, in my experience. So
That's interesting, yeah.
So I'm curious whether your experience is like that and whether there's more connection between 1 and 2 than you're suggesting.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I pushed by Susan, and because I was also, not pushed by Susan, implored by Susan because I was extremely late with the abstract. I put something down about 2 types of judgment and made a hasty distinction between secular and religious, because in the second case I was thinking in terms of the sort of the hanging judge, the critic who sort of casts out and decides who's in and who's out, and so on. And yeah, a moment's reflection, as you rightly say, that's why I didn't use the distinction in the talk, reminds us that that interpretation of texts absolutely comes out of a long tradition of religious interpretation and is completely inseparable from it. Yeah, I may have in my opposition perhaps I did at one moment make it sound as if the second can't be taught. I think I was wanting just to get, I was wanting to pick up on a kind of caricature in a way, hence the Cyril Connolly and the wine tasting, which this is, that this is somehow some kind of, that there's some sort of connoisseurial mystique. And it's certainly true that in the course of the 20th century, in criticism, insofar as that kind of judgment too became relegated, it was because it was seen to have far too much of the gentlemanly, connoisseurial, amateurish, you just know it when you see it, kind of unteachable thing about it. So I wanted to point up that just at the level of caricature to explain, I think, what happened in 20th century criticism after Richards, but which shouldn't have happened because Richards clearly is not arguing for that. And I tend to agree with you that it can be taught, and I try to do that both in my reviews and constantly in the classroom, but not about the political status of the text. Absolutely, you know, this detail in Flaubert strikes me as beautiful. Does it strike you as beautiful? Why? Or, you know, comedy. It's always worth it. There's this idea somehow that if you explain a joke, you make it unfunny. Well, insofar as you're not telling the joke, you make it unfunny. But actually, if you it's really interesting to explain how a joke works, as we know from Freud and others, and you can do it pretty effectively. So yeah, I think you're right. Both these modes can be taught and shouldn't ever have been separated, but simply were by a certain movement in formalism and poetics.
Rainey Daston. Sorry, the list is long. Everyone who's raised their hands, I've seen you already. I've written you down. Yeah, I'll get to you.
Thanks, James. It was such a probing talk. My question is about how perhaps Judgment 1 becomes Judgment 2, and perhaps also a thought about why it is that judgments are so notoriously opaque, why it's so hard to give reasons for Judgment 2.
Right.
So anything that we learn as a craft or as a skill or through life experience starts out as being painstaking, meticulous, explicit, knowing where every finger is on the piano keyboard. As we become better at it, it becomes somehow pushed into the unconscious, and we get faster and faster, better and better, and less able to access it. I have a friend, philosopher friend, nothing is more explicit than formal logic. He is a consummate logician. Often, when you sit next to him at a talk, you see him stirring in his seat. He has detected a logical flaw in the argument, but he cannot yet tell you what it is. And he is almost always right. So it's not about the material itself. There's nothing mysterious about aesthetics. Right. This is about logic, the most explicit and formal of human reasoning. Right. So there's something here about the circuitry of human beings, which is at stake.
Totally, that's absolutely wonderful. I slightly misheard you, and I thought you said a consummate magician. So I was thinking, like, that's something he does on the side, you know. Yeah, but that's really splendidly put. Yeah.
So now I have Fintan O'Toole.
Thanks very much. That was really, really wonderful. At the risk of talking shop, right? So having kind of worked as a professional critic as well, it seems to me, and I found your distinction between the two ideas of what is at stake, I mean, very illuminating and absolutely persuasive. But isn't there a third one when you're actually practicing criticism, right? Which is, and I suppose it goes back to the political, the ideological, the sense of risk in whether it's a novel or in my case when I was reviewing a play, right, is actually very important, right? So I don't know whether this is your experience, but there tends to be an inverse relationship between the sense of low stakes in a work and the possibility of formal perfection. Right? So, particularly this is true in the theatre. I think you know, we all see now the standard form of a play is 3 actors, 90 minutes, very low stakes, one idea, you know, and it's perfectly done. It's absolutely perfectly done. The acting is terrific, the direction is terrific, and you just go away thinking, I really don't give one damn about the whole thing, you know. Whereas, you know, on the other extreme, I mean, there's a lot of work which is formally extremely flawed, but is flawed because it's there's taking risk, you know, and there's, you know, the stakes feel real, and you yourself feel at that moment when you're engaged with this that actually, I don't know what the hell I'm thinking about this or feeling about this, and I have to go and try to deal with it. And Shakespeare is a great example of this. I mean, some of Shakespeare's greatest plays are formally really flawed. I mean, you look at Othello and you think, if you were to stand back from that, it makes no sense whatsoever. You know, the time scheme doesn't work, the motivations are all over the place. You know, but there's so much at stake in the language and also in the politics of it. I mean, in the issue of this is a black man in this situation. You know, the stakes are so high. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit about your own practice in those terms. I mean, do you, when you're choosing what to write about, automatically tend to exclude things that may well be, you know, neat and formally impressive, but actually are very not worth writing about for those extraneous reasons, which are not strictly speaking aesthetic, but are to do with the moment, are to do with what it might mean and what it might spark in you as a writer as well about you know, how you're addressing an audience right here, right now.
Yeah. I think you said last night, Fintan, at dinner that being a theatre critic in Dublin was one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. Yes, that question of selection is I think about that a lot. I think what I'd say is a little bit like the sort of use all there is to use formulation. I was the sort of the large baggy sort of pragmatism of reading. It's rather similar for me in selection. That's to say, I'm doing I'm sure you do too when you choose a book to review. I'm doing a bit of everything. So I very much listen to friends and writers who say, you know, I'm hearing about this novel. It's fantastic. You've got to look at it. I listen to. I get sent a lot by publishers, and I do try to look at those books as they read in them, as the phrase goes, rather than read through them. And then I get suggestions, obviously, from the literary editor at the New Yorker too, or from academics, from everywhere. And I think, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That you might well decide not to review something that's formally good, but where the stakes are low. But you might take on something. I mean, I remember doing that, for instance, when I remember in 2011, I think Archipelago Books sent me Knausgaard's My Struggle. It was just volume 1. And that was an example of the publisher just saying, I think you would be interested in this. And I started reading it. And as we know from that, particularly that first volume, he himself has said, the first 20 pages I really, really tried to write as well as possible, and then the rest is just crap. And you got a sense of that. And it didn't matter really, because you were absolutely aware that some kind of weirdly intense phenomenology of the self was going on, and that this was very ambitious and worth writing about. So I absolutely know what you're talking about.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to try to just ask for short questions and short answers. Yes.
I'm perfectly. I'm
yeah.
a good time.
Yeah. So Peter Gallison is next.
I still want to pursue the question of the sort of the logical or structural relationship between the two hermeneutics of suspicion and evaluation.
Yep.
I mean, one sense is that they're complementary. Like an architect's responsible for keeping the house from falling down and has aesthetic ambitions for formally. Another might be that they both participate in something. I take that to be Caustic's point. You could have pleasure from both.
Yep.
And a third might be that after a while, the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion becomes part of how we do evaluation.
Yeah.
But there are others. But my question is, when you say that you need both or they're not separable, in what sense are they not separable? Are they one of those three? Are they something else?
I just think, well, I'll just speak about myself. I just find that I don't know what comes first, is how I would reformulate that. And I don't know how it is for you, but, you know, a text comes my way, and I'm instantly responsive at the level of pleasure, which must be something to do with aesthetic evaluation, certainly something to do with the Kantian thing of feeling, of the pleasant or the unpleasant if the thing isn't working. And at the same time, I seem to be doing something like stakes one, like the hermeneutic evaluation rather than the aesthetic evaluation. So I just don't. I mean, what is the thing that Richard says? He says, doesn't he? I thought that was interesting. He says. He does use the word feeling, doesn't he? He says, the whole world, in brief, of abstract opinion and disputation about matters of feeling. And yeah, so I think for me that I don't make the distinction, and I like the three items you were just putting in a list. That makes a lot of sense to me.
I have 3 people left on my list. For the people who aren't included, by the way, don't feel bad. I've also relegated my own question. So it applies to me too. So I have Peter Kramer, then Thomas Williams, and then Kristen Gotze. First is Peter Kramer. Yeah.
I hope I can be quick, but since this relates to the prior questions in a way, but I want to ask about a dialectic or about time. I think Claudia's question was a little bit about time. So, you know, is there a relationship between, say, T.S. Eliot and Cleanth Brooks? You know, that there's sort of, that if you get close reading, you can have technically non-popular, complicated poetry.
Right.
And what also do you make of changes in taste, so that we say certain books are unreadable, but the internal criticism, like the Bart, the SZ or whatever, remains valid? So that's sort of a question in there.
Yeah. That's, I mean, I didn't touch on that, but of course, a fascinating thing about 20th century criticism is, as you suggest, is its very close relation between critical production and creative production. So yes, the new criticism needed a certain kind of poem to work on. The poets themselves, Eliot would be the example, were often themselves critics and responsive to that criticism, right, to what was going on. Same thing happens after the war with French theory, let's say in the Nouveau Roman, where the criticism really does blend with the kind of fiction that someone like Barthes says at least that he prefers. I don't actually believe him, because I think that his whole hostility to realism was a defensive posture, because he was actually deeply in love with realism. But officially, at least, he was against realism, or a fierce critique of a certain kind of realism, and liked writers like Robbe-Grillet and so on. So yeah, that interrelation seems very interesting. Or think of Russian formalism and the kind of texts that they get to work on. Yeah.
Thomas.
Thank you, James. I wish I could be a student of yours at Harvard. That sounds like a good way to spend your time. I'll be quick. Just one thing you said really caught my attention among many, but you said you're probably a better reader at 40 than 20. That's probably true, but I wonder what you think about what I've been experiencing now that I'm in my 40s, which is that I know more, and I find myself to sometimes, maybe oftentimes, be a worse critic than I was when I was in my 20s, and I was so hungry and captured by wonder. And how do you maintain over these decades of connoisseurship the kind of wonder? In the same way that I think it's harder to be surprised by a very good glass of wine in my 40s than when I first discovered, like this wine I'd never tasted before. you know?
That's so well put. I'd say briefly,
Louisa?
I'm a better reader, but a poorer critic than I was at 30. I'm a better reader for the ways in which we all were. You know more, you've lived more, you've read more texts, you're better at the sort of things that Rainey was talking about. There's a certain kind of practice that just becomes unconsciously pretty good. But I'm a poorer critic in the sense of the judging critic, and that's because I'm not as hungry or as fearless as I was. I don't want to hurt people. I was happy to hurt people when I was 30 and 35. I mean, I recently had to do a thing with Salman Rushdie, which was quite excruciating for me, because he was very gracious, but I was aware that I'd reviewed his novel Fury in the pages of the New Republic, and had begun the review. This novel exhausts all negative superlatives. And I just wouldn't write that now. I'm more timid, but I'm also just, I don't want to, I can see the human being in a way that I just couldn't, and was determined not to at the age of 30 and 35, because I thought, this is literature. We don't deal in such things as personages.
Last question, and I'm going to just jump on, you see the human being. I know we're going to talk about AI and judgment tomorrow, but I was thinking about the machine-shaped hand. Okay. And when it was published in The Guardian, Jeanette Winterson, they published right next to it a kind of commentary about why it was a good story. And this question of the affective relationship between the critic and the creator, what happens when the creator is what is called a democracy of ghosts in that story? Right. How does AI and the generation of creativity from a non-human source change the job of the critic?
It's very. I know of that piece, but I haven't read it. It's weird that phrase, that democracy of ghosts, is actually, as I remember it, that's a line from Panin. Nabokov uses that line, democracy of ghosts. I wonder if AI was just. It's quite possible, just right, hoovering it up, vacuuming it up. I don't know. It's such a massive subject. The Authors Guild, I think it's called the Authors Guild or Writers Guild in America, is considering a thing whereby certain novels actually written by humans will come now with a sticker saying "written by an actual human being," which seems terrifying to me. Though at least you'd know. But yes, it's getting better and better and better, and so far I've dealt with it by ignoring it. It's working quite well for me at the moment.
Please join me in thanking James Wood.